Hi everybody, I'm Holly Dickman, Water Conservation Specialist for the City of Hayes. And unfortunately I couldn't be at the Hayes Public Library on April 25th to give this presentation in person for their Urban Garden Day, but we're going to do our best to go ahead and give it virtually. I've never given a presentation in this manner, so I apologize if there are some technical glitches or difficulties as we go along, but we're going to try and make this work. As I mentioned, I am the Water Conservation Specialist for the City of Hayes, and I've been in this position now for almost 3 years. But just to give you a little bit of background for those of you that may not know me, prior to that, for 10.5 years, I served as the Ellis County Extension horticulture agent. And so I have a lot of experience with dealing with plant issues, water conservation in the landscape, diagnosing plant problems, helping the public with those types of things. So that's where a lot of my experience comes from, and I always like to just mention that in case you're not familiar with who I am or what my background is. But today we're going to talk about the WaterSmart landscape, and this is something that I talk about a lot, and you may have heard us talk about WaterSmart Hayes and WaterSmart landscaping, and so I'm going to go through some slides and explain exactly what that is and what exactly we mean when we talk about the WaterSmart landscape. To get started, I think it's really important to talk about the benefits of landscaping in general. A lot of times when we talk about water conservation in the landscape, I feel like the conversation oftentimes goes to reducing that landscape or getting rid of plants or green things in the yard, trying to reduce that down. But really there's a lot of benefits to actually having green space on your property. And this is just a list of several different things that are benefits, increased property and sale value, connecting people with nature. Of course, that's really important these days. And then just also lowering energy costs. If you have shade trees that are shading the house during the heat of summer, of course, that will reduce some of those energy costs with your air conditioning and things like that. Protecting soil and water, definitely a huge benefit of having landscaping in place, plants in place, roots in place. Roots are a good thing. They help to filter the soil or filter the water, excuse me, and help get that water to go down into the soil versus just running off. And we'll talk about some of these other things as we go along. But I wanted to bring this up because there's a really great study out there. It's called the Hidden Value of Landscapes, Implications for Drought Planning. It's from Colorado State University. If you're interested in learning more about some of those benefits, I'd encourage you to go ahead and search for that on the internet. But it's from Colorado State University. But again, just there's so many benefits to actually having green space, and we will talk about how you can make that green space as water efficient as possible. So let's move on. So why the emphasis on being water smart? Well, if you're from the area, you're very familiar with some of these issues, but we have a limited water supply. The city of Hayes is the only city in Kansas that has a population of over 15,000 people, but does not have a sustainable source of water. So we are very dependent on rainfall and well levels and things like that. We also know that water conservation serves as its own water source. And so we have been conserving water in Hayes for many years, and really it has been to our benefit. We've been able to rely on that conservation as an additional source of water. Water conservation certainly will save you money. If you're paying for your water, then the more you save, the more water you save, the less you will pay for that water. And of course, saving water is just the right thing to do. As we go forward in the future, demand for water is increased, higher populations, aging infrastructures, all of those things will increase our need for water conservation. And so it's just the right thing to do. And I feel like as we go forward, it will definitely be more in the spotlight than it is already nationwide. I always like to show this picture. It's a very poor quality picture, but it does serve the purpose just to show where we are in relation to the Ogallala Aquifer. If you see that area in blue, that's the area that is actually the Ogallala Aquifer. And if you know where Ellis County is and where Hayes lies, you can see that we are just east of where that is. So we do not sit over top of the Ogallala Aquifer. I asked that question during talks with kids, middle school kids, and that is oftentimes a misconception that we actually sit over that aquifer, but we do not. So that is where our well levels and our water supplies are very much dependent on rainfall and precipitation that we receive throughout the year. I wanted to show a picture of a drought monitor, which if you're not familiar with the drought monitor, this is something that you can look up online, and it will give you an indication of what, how extensive drought might be in our area at that particular moment. And so this one is from way back in January 31st of 2012. And if any of you remember 2012, that was an extremely harsh year as far as drought goes, but this is how we were in January of that year. And I just want to show a little comparison. This time of year, we weren't really in too bad a shape. It was a little abnormally dry, but not overly droughty. But then if you fast forward to August of that year, as you can see in just those short 6 months or so, 7, 8 months, we were in exceptional drought. And so it does not take a lot of time for us to actually switch and you know, go from not in such a bad shape into extreme or exceptional drought. And I just like to show that for that comparison. Here's where we are today. Kansas really is in great shape, except for the very southwestern corner of the state. And, you know, that's great. We're in good shape right now. However, I will say that as of the taping of this presentation, we are actually fairly dry. Average rainfall for this time of year should be just under 5 inches. And so far for the year, we have had just over 2.5. So we really could use a little bit of moisture at this time, but we'll see how things go in the spring. I can't predict the weather. If I could, I'd be doing something else. But right now, we are in great shape, and I hope that continues. So I want to talk a little bit about water usage in Hayes. I kind of touched on this a little bit already, but we do have the lowest per capita water usage in the state. We use right around 90 gallons per person per day. And this little chart that I'm showing here is just the difference between summertime usage and wintertime usage. And that's averaged between those months. So average January, February, March, we used around 1,200,000 gallons per day. And then during the summer months, it goes up to 1,900,000 gallons per day. Average yearly water production is just over 670 million gallons. But I will say the population has increased over the years, while the usage or water use per capita has gone down. Back in 1979, which was the highest on record for per capita water use, it was around 187 gallons per person, and now it's around 90. So that's really an improvement. And the population back then was around 16,000, and now it's just over 21,000. This is another chart or two. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to give a comparison of water usage during the growing season versus the non-growing season. And so growing season, I consider that April through September. Non-growing season is typically October through March, but we can certainly have some nice weather through October and even into early November where we might be watering turf grass and things like that. As you can see, back in 2012, The non-growing season versus the growing season, there was a pretty big jump. And that's typical. We have more water usage during that growing season because of that outdoor water use. And I just like to show this example. This is a local business. I'm not going to name any names, but this is just one example of water use that can be pretty extreme in the growing season. And so you can see that their water usage during the off season or the non-growing season is pretty minimal. And then once that growing season kicks in, their water usage goes way, way up. And this is actually in cubic feet. This isn't gallons, this is cubic feet. So 1 cubic foot equals 7.48 gallons. And in July of 2016, they used almost 45,000 gallons of water in that 1 month, which is extreme. That's way extreme. So why do I show this? Because upwards of 50% of our water usage can be accounted to outdoor water usage. But of that 50% of our overall water usage, up to 50% of that is actually wasted. And in my experience, I firmly believe this. Overwatering, inefficient practices, all of that accounts to the waste of that water that is being used during the growing season. So back to WaterSmart landscaping. What exactly is that? Well, it's essentially landscaping with water conservation as a major objective, also known as ZERO-SCAPING, but I don't like to use that term anymore because it's often misunderstood. So I don't use ZERO-SCAPING anymore. I call it WaterSmart landscaping. We'll talk about exactly what that is. But ZERO-SCAPING essentially is the term that was coined by the Denver Water Department in 1981 to describe landscaping with water conservation as the major objective. And it's simply just being smart with your outdoor water use. So that's what we're talking about with WaterSmart landscaping, just being smart. When it's raining, don't water. You know, it's sad that we have to remind people of that, but if it's rained 2 inches that week, certainly do not need to be running those irrigation systems. And so that's just part of being water smart. Before we can talk about exactly what WaterSmart landscaping is, I think it's important to talk about what it is not. And this is where some of those misconceptions come in. WaterSmart landscaping is not dry only. You can water a landscape and still be water smart. It is not just rocks and gravel. Unfortunately, we see a lot of that, but it does not have to be that way. And it is not necessarily lawnless. You can have turf grass in a WaterSmart landscape. It's not just native plants, although native plants certainly have their benefits, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it does not have to be just native plants. And it is not a boring monoculture of spiny plants. So you don't have to have cactus and yucca and things like that. You can have other sorts of variety. It's not a specific look. It's not a particular group of plants, like I mentioned, doesn't have to be cactus. And it is not ZERO-SCAPING. Everyone has seen ZERO-SCAPING. And when I show you some pictures, you'll know what I'm talking about, but it is not ZERO-SCAPING. It does not have to look like this to have a WaterSmart landscape. This one is not in haze, obviously, but it cracks me up because there's the pond, and this area in the back of that picture looks very bright green, so I'm guessing it's artificial turf. But this is not a WaterSmart landscape. This is ZERO-SCAPING. There's not a lot of benefit of having a landscape like this. So what is WaterSmart landscaping? It's essentially water conservation through creative landscaping. And there are many different ways to do this. It's actually the combination of 7 gardening principles that we'll go through to create a landscape that is not only beautiful, but as efficient as possible when it comes to water. And some of these pictures are from haze, some of them are not. This one is, but there's a lot of different things that can be done. And we'll go through some of the steps. This is also in haze. Like I mentioned, it's a combination of 7 gardening principles that maximize water efficiency while creating that attractive landscape at the same time. And I think that's where sometimes it's a misconception that we can't have both, but we'll go through ways to create that. So the 7 steps that I'm going to talk about: 1, planning and design; soil preparation; efficient irrigation; mulch; right place in the right plant, or right plant in the right place, excuse me, or plant zones; practical turf areas; and proper maintenance. And I am going to spend just a little bit more time on 3 that I think are the most often overlooked, and that's soil preparation, efficient irrigation, and mulch. And those are also 3 that really we can do at any time prior to landscaping or creating that landscape, or even if we have an established landscape, we can go back in and do some of those things. So the first step, planning and design. It's always best if you can have a plan and pick plants that will fit into that plan. But planning is essential in creating a sustainable and attractive landscape. And it's great to be able to look at the landscape, or the property, I should say, and determine, you know, does water sit in certain areas? Does it flow in certain areas? Drainage. Do you have landscape trees that can help block the sun? Like I mentioned, energy savings, things like that. Plants purchased should fit into a plan. Hopefully, that's the first step. Consider the factors that affect water use. Are there slopes? Do you have hardscapes? Do you have other things in the landscape that can help slow runoff? What about hardscapes, permeable pavers, a flagstone patio, things that can help actually keep the water on the property versus letting it run off? Limiting turf areas and take into consideration microclimates. Microclimate is simply an area of the landscape or an area of your yard that might have a little bit different environment than the rest of the yard. So by that I mean, you know, maybe the west side of the house gets extremely hot during the summertime, and you might need to consider using very drought tolerant and heat tolerant plants on that side, and maybe less water intensive plants on that side of the house. And here's just an example of a microclimate. This is actually on the south side of the extension office where I used to work at 601 Main Street. And there's a flower planting there. Actually, there's a really nice display garden there now. But it's the south side of a brick building surrounded by bricks and concrete, and it's very harsh conditions during the heat of summer. So this is something I would consider a microclimate. You also want to group plants that have similar water requirements. Sometimes you see maybe a shrub or flowers planted at the base of a tree, things like that. Not necessarily recommended because they have different watering requirements. If you have annual flowers around the base of a tree, as shown in this picture, then you are either watering the flowers incorrectly or you're watering that tree incorrectly, because they have different water requirements. And so it's important to try to group plants with similar water requirements together. And that's why this picture of these 3 trees in this turf area is a great example of creating that bed or that landscape zone where those trees can be irrigated separately. Soil preparation. This is one of the most important steps, and it's one of the most often overlooked. But truly, if we take care of the roots, the tops will grow themselves. This is an old saying that one of my old colleagues, a flower specialist from K-State, used to say all the time, and it really is true. Soil health is so critical to plant growth, but it is also very critical to water efficiency. Many times the problems in the landscape are not caused by pests, diseases, or a lack of nutrients, but it's actually the poor soil physical conditions. And if you think about soil in Hays, Kansas, oftentimes it's very heavy, it's hard to dig, and it's got a lot of clay. And so there are ways to help improve this, to help with water to actually go down through the soil profile versus running off. One of the things that you can also do is to test your soil about every 3 years to determine pH and nutrient levels. Now, this is something that I certainly would recommend because for water quality consideration, you don't want to just go out and start applying fertilizer and nutrients if you don't know what's already there. And if you're not testing your soil, then you're just guessing as to what you might need. And adding too much of those things can be a detriment to water pollution and things like that. You can have runoff and cause nutrient issues downstream. However, in regards to water efficiency, one of the biggest and best things that you can do is to incorporate organic matter. Organic matter includes things that break down over time. So I have some examples listed there, but composted manure, cotton burr, compost in general, and peat moss, things like that. Definitely anything that breaks down over time improves the soil's organic matter content. And the benefits of that is that it improves soil structure. So like I mentioned a couple times already, it'll allow the water to actually filter down through the soil versus running off. It helps to improve soil aeration, which is very important for plant root growth. And plant roots need oxygen. So if you have really heavy soil, sometimes it's easily compacted if you have a lot of traffic or just mower traffic, those types of things over the landscape can compact that heavy clay soil and make it very hard for roots to grow and for the water to infiltrate down. It also can help hold the moisture and increase nutrient availability. And one of the best things too is that it'll increase your beneficial microbes, microorganisms, earthworms, all of those things that indicate that a healthy soil is present will be increased with the increase of organic matter. It is recommended that you incorporate 1 to 3 inches of compost into the soil of a new lawn, shrub, flower beds, gardens. Lots of people are talking about gardening right now. Very important to improve the soil if you have heavy clay soil. Now, this is not a one-time do it and it's done type of thing. This is sometimes a multi-year process, but over time, your soil will improve and you'll end up being much happier because you'll have healthier plants and not as much runoff. This is just a picture of some people incorporating some leaves in the fall. Fall is a great time to incorporate organic matter a lot of times because it is more readily available. Also with the compost that you can purchase or you can get for free from some of the compost sites. Fall is a great time to do it because a lot of times the soils are a little bit drier depending on the year, and that way it'll sit over the winter time and be workable in the spring when you're ready to plant. If you have existing flower beds or existing shrub beds, you might be wondering, well, how can I go ahead and do that? And it is a little more difficult. However, you can go ahead and top dress with compost or, you know, go ahead and put some around those plants. And over time, it will start to work itself down into that soil. One of the easiest things you can do, and I'll talk much more about this in a little bit, is to use organic mulch. So organic mulch is mulch that breaks down. Over time, that will add organic matter to your soil. The third step in a WaterSmart landscape is efficient irrigation. And of course, this is one that I talk about a ton these days because I'm a water conservation specialist, but this is one that really is so critical. All plants do require water to get established. So by that, I mean have good root systems under them and are ready to grow. And you definitely need to water those plants. I have not heard of a plant that does not require water as of yet. And establishment of those plants, and we're talking trees, shrubs, perennial flowers, depending on what type of plant it is, it could take anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Sometimes trees take even longer to get fully established. So during that establishment period, it is very important to continue to water them as needed. Now, when we're talking about watering, we're talking about deep watering and not very often. When you're getting plants established, you might need to water a little more frequently, but generally speaking, we want to water things deeply, and that encourages deep roots. If we water, say, for example, turf grass, very often, maybe we have sprinklers set to run every day or every other day, and we don't run that time for very long, and it only gets the top inch or so of that soil wet, then that's where those roots want to stay and they want to grow right there in that layer. And so when we get into the really hot summer months of July and August, then that's the first turf grass that I see have issues. Because that top layer just dries out so quickly. So if your roots are within that top layer and it's 100 degrees that day and it's windy, that dries out very quickly and that turf grass starts to stress. And so if you have turf grass, it's very beneficial to water it very deeply. We're talking about 6 to 8 inches deep at least, and then allow it to dry out before you ever water again. This will encourage those roots to go down deep. And so then when we get into those really hot, dry summer months, even if it's hot and windy that day, those roots will be down deeper and they will be able to take advantage of some soil moisture that will be down deep versus that top layer that gets dried out right away. So deep and infrequent, and this will encourage deep roots. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about turf grass or a vegetable garden or flower bed or shrubs. It is highly encouraged to water deeply and then allow those things to dry out in between time. The other thing you want to do is to adjust your watering schedule based on that soil moisture and not on a schedule. So go out and actually feel the soil or dig down. One thing that I always recommend is to use some sort of soil probe. You can use a piece of rebar, a stiff piece of wire, a long screwdriver, something that you can use to actually poke down into the soil. And if you feel resistance, then you've probably hit dry soil. So this is great if you're trying to figure out how long you need to water something to get it down to a certain depth. Let's say you're watering a tree. You can let the garden hose trickle for a little while and then go out and measure and see. And if you know that you've gotten down about 5 inches, then you let it run just a little bit longer. And then once you get down to that depth that you are needing, then you will know, well, it took me this long to get down to that depth, so I need to water to that depth next time as well. Plants don't waste water, people do. And so plants will use what they need. If you are watering beyond their root systems or, beyond what they require, then it's just a waste of water. So a lot of times it is oftentimes it's hard for people to understand that when it's hot and dry, that doesn't necessarily mean that the plant needs to be watered. Always check the soil. If the soil is wet, then that plant does not need any more water, and you can do a lot of damage from overwatering. I mentioned that roots need oxygen, so if you're overwatering, you're keeping that soil constantly saturated, that causes root damage, and that can cause a lot of problems with your plants. So again, don't overwater. This picture is an over-exaggeration, but that is one of the biggest mistakes that I see and often hear about is overwatering, especially when we get into some of those hot, dry summers where we haven't had any rain. Then people seem to overwater a little bit more. As far as timing of irrigation, it is often recommended that you're watering early in the morning when humidity is high and evaporation is low. And also those leaves have a chance to dry off. And sometimes with turf grass, this is important because you might be setting yourself up for some disease issues depending on our weather if you're watering in the evening or late at night. It is typically less windy in the morning. We know there's some exceptions to that, but a lot of times it is a little less windy in the morning. And you may or may not have higher water pressure in the morning as well. But also remember, if you live in Hayes, starting June 1st, we do have water restrictions that take place from noon to 7 p.m. Watering outdoors is prohibited, or any water use outdoors is prohibited, actually. So something to keep in mind, and really that just is to avoid those high evaporating winds and heat of summer. So it's most efficient to water in the morning or in the evening. Another thing to help with your watering efficiency is to actually have a rain gauge to measure how much rainfall or precipitation you are receiving on your property. We all know that sometimes storms go through town and we can have 3 inches on the northwest side of town and maybe nothing or very little on the southeast side of town. So it's really helpful to have a rain gauge on your property so that you know exactly how much moisture you have received. Again, water all plants deeply and infrequently, and there are some exceptions to that. Newly seeded gardens, newly seeded lawns, that's different. That's where you're needing to water more frequently to keep that top layer of soil moist, but that's the exception. For the most part, we want to water deeply and infrequently. Another thing I want to mention is with irrigation, whether it's in your garden, in your yard, landscape, turf grass. A lot of times with our heavy clay soil, you can't put a ton of water down all at once. You need to do what's called cycle and soak. So if you have an irrigation system and you start to notice that it's pooling, the water is starting to pool up and maybe run or run off a slope, then it's time to shut that down, let the water soak in, and then turn it back on later after that water has already soaked into the soil and watered a little bit more. It's called cycle and soak. So run it a little while, let it soak in, come back if you need to later to get it down to the depth that you need to get it. But you don't want to put it all down at once, because with our heavy soils, a lot of times that water will just start to run off, and that's not doing any good for those plants. So I want to talk a little bit about watering tips for particular things. First one being turf. And I have mentioned a couple of these things already, but for turf grass, and I'm talking cool season turf grass primarily because that's what we're watering the most, is to wait for signs of drought stress. You do not need to water that turf grass every single day, especially if you've encouraged a deep root system and things are well established. Go ahead and wait for signs of drought stress. A lot of times if you walk across the turf grass and your footprints remain, that's a sign of drought stress, and maybe that lawn needs a drink. But you want to make sure to apply the amount of water needed to sufficiently get that whole root system wet. And so for turf grass, we're talking about 6 to 8 inches deep at least. And in most years, 1 to 1.5 inch per week, depending on rainfall, is what's needed for those systems. And again, let those turf grass areas dry out before you ever go back and water again. When we're talking about trees and shrubs, again, water deeply and infrequently, but you want to soak those to a depth of 12 to 18 inches. And this is simply because that's where the majority of a tree's root systems are found, is within the top 1 to 1.5 feet of soil. Newly planted trees, rule of thumb, about 10 gallons of water per week if there's no rain. For shrubs, about 5 gallons of water per week. Soaker hoses work really well. Another method is to actually have a 5-gallon bucket Fill it up with water. I should mention, before you fill it up with water, put just a little tiny pinhole down at the base of that 5-gallon bucket. Set it on one side of the tree under that drip line or where the branches reach out, and then allow that water to kind of trickle out. Go ahead and move it to the other side of the tree, fill it up again, allow it to trickle out. Soaker hoses work really well. These are the hoses that actually seep water, and you can kind of spiral those around under the base of the tree. Showing these, sometimes there's different brands, but one that's common is called Gator Bag or something like that. But these actually have holes down at the base that allow the water to filter out or kind of trickle out. Now, on a very young tree, this might be okay, but as the tree grows, it's really not ideal to have all the moisture right there at the base of the tree. You want to move that out as they grow. For trees and shrubs, again, we don't have a lot of sandy soils, but if we do, then watering needs to be a little more frequent. Heavy soils, once a week is sufficient. And again, check the soil. Just make sure you check the soil before you go out and pour water onto the tree. Continue watering whenever the soil is dry until those trees or shrubs become established. Now, I mentioned earlier that this could take several years. So keep an eye on those trees and shrubs, and trees are a big investment, so it's important to irrigate them properly. Just briefly going to talk about vegetable and flower gardens, although vegetable gardens I know are more attractive to people this year with everything that's been going on. Again, watering deeply and infrequently is important. Once those seeds have started growing, once those plants have been planted, then you want to make sure and get the good root system under them that they need to survive our hot, dry summers. Again, with vegetables, flowers, it depends on the type of plant you have, but generally speaking, we're talking watering to a depth of 12 to 18 inches, slowly and gradually, so that none of it is running off. And you want to allow that soil to dry out in between time. Now, with some of our vegetable plants, for instance, tomatoes, they don't like to have that watered and then let it completely dry out, and then wet and then completely dry out. They don't perform well with that type of watering. So there are some exceptions to that. Some of those need more even, regular watering. But again, deeply and not very often. You can certainly get by with watering a garden once or twice a week, depending on the weather. It does not have to be watered every single day. There's different ways to water a garden. These are just some images to show the examples. We have sprinklers, which is an ideal. Soaker hoses, where you actually have the water seeping out, and then drip irrigation, both of which put that irrigation water right where you need it, down at the root system of the plant. And it'll also lessen that watering of those areas in between the plants, which will reduce your weed pressure there. Just a few notes about automatic irrigation systems. Ideally, automatic irrigation systems should not be set on a regular schedule. You should be able to turn those on and off as you need them. The other thing is that you want to make sure that you have separate zones or different areas of irrigation for different types of plants. So hopefully your turf grass is not set up on the same zone as your shrub bed or your flower bed. If you don't have a rain sensor, that is something that I would recommend you get. This way, at least if it is raining, the system will be shut off. It'll sense the moisture and it'll shut the irrigation system off. Now, if you have a rain sensor, it is important to place it in a proper location. I would not recommend placing it under the eave of a house or in the corner of a fence or against the house in a place where the rain's never going to hit it. And I've seen some of those in town. So if you have a rain sensor, it is important to have it out in the open where the rain's actually going to touch the thing. Smart irrigation controllers, something to consider. There's so many different technologies out there on the market right now. Some of them you can control on your smartphone. Some of them will collect data actually from the yard via soil sensors, or they'll use weather data to help determine and run that system. And it can be quite complicated to set up, but once it's all set up with the parameters, it may actually save you quite a bit of water, especially if you've been watering on a very set schedule. It's really important to know how your irrigation system works, or if you don't know, then hopefully the people that are there to maintain it for you are checking it regularly for leaks. And it's really important to have proper winterization and those things done so that you don't have some systems with issues with breaks or hairline fractures or things that will cause leaks that go undetected. It's really important to keep an eye on those things. Make sure the sprinkler heads are adjusted so that you're actually watering the turf grass and not the hardscapes. And as many of you may know, if you live in Hayes, it is actually an ordinance that you are not allowed to water hardscapes, and you can be issued a ticket for those sorts of things. So try to keep those sprinkler heads where they need to be. Another little device that you can purchase, especially if you're using your own spigots to do some watering. I know I'm guilty of sometimes turning on a soaker hose or drip irrigation and then forgetting about it. And so then you are suddenly reminded in the middle of the night that, oh, I left the irrigation system on, or I left the soaker hose running, or something like that. If you purchase one of these little hose bib timers, this is something that you can actually attach to your spigot, and it will shut the water off after so long. So you can determine how long you want that to run for, and then you don't have to worry about maybe getting distracted and forgetting about it later. I want to talk quite a bit about mulch. This is another very important step of a WaterSmart landscape, and there's so many benefits to mulch. Mulch actually helps to maintain the moisture that we do put down or that we receive from Mother Nature, and it keeps it from evaporating so quickly from the soil surface. It also helps to maintain temperature. So if we have a cool night, then it will help keep the soil cooler. If we have warm temperatures, it almost serves like a blanket. So going into fall, it'll help keep those soils a little bit warmer. It'll stop that big fluctuation in temperatures that we get. It inhibits weed growth. That's a huge benefit to me. I don't like to pull weeds. So having a nice thick mulch layer there will help with those weeds. And as I mentioned earlier, if you use organic mulch, it will help to increase your organic matter content in your soil over time. With organic mulch, there's various types available, but anything that breaks down over time is what I would consider organic mulch. So pine needles, leaves, grass clippings, wood chips, pine nuggets, any of those types of things, all considered organic mulch. Now there's also inorganic mulch, which includes your rock, gravel, rubber, and fabric. This is often used, but it does not provide those soil benefits that we talked about with organic mulch. In some cases, rock mulch can actually increase soil temperature. And in the summertime, you can imagine this to be very true, where it absorbs that heat. And one of the biggest problems with this is that it does not allow that soil to actually cool down in the evening. And so you have this constant hot or warm situation, and those plants just can't recover from the heat of day. Some of your light colored rock may also reflect heat back up onto the plants, and this is also detrimental. Another thing to consider is that rock mulch on heavy clay soil is very compacting, and so that can also become an issue with runoff and not allowing that water to go down into the soil. Another thing to consider is that organic or inorganic mulch, excuse me, rock mulch, is often layered on top of landscape fabric. So when you have those things together, that creates even more issues, because then you have this extra barrier there that over time will get debris, dust, and other things that will prevent that water from actually penetrating down into the soil. A lot of times people think that rock mulch is low maintenance, and it is not. Oftentimes it can become a weedy mess, and this is just because of what I mentioned. We have dust, we have debris, we have things that settle in those nooks and crannies of that rock mulch and down onto that landscape fabric. And unfortunately, that landscape fabric was designed to prevent things from growing up through it. It was not designed to prevent things from growing down from the top down. And so weeds will get very easily interwoven. The roots will get interwoven into that landscape fabric, and it makes it difficult to maintain. I've pulled weeds in the rocks before. It's not fun. It's much easier to pull weeds in a nice layer of organic mulch here and there. When we apply mulch, it's important to do it properly. One of the biggest mistakes is creating what's called mulch volcanoes. This is where we actually pile the mulch up around the tree trunk, and it needs to be actually a mulch donut versus a mulch volcano. So you want to put mulch around that tree trunk. And this is where it gets hard doing this virtually, because I can't show my descriptions as well, but you want to make sure to, excuse me, make sure that you have mulch at least an inch or two away from the tree trunk, and then taper it out around underneath that tree canopy. The problem with having a mulch volcano, or where that mulch is sitting directly up against the trunk, is that it creates a nice moist environment against that trunk. And over time, that can be a very attractive place for insects and other issues there, but it can also create some rot issues on that trunk and cause problems with the tree itself. Mulch is available in a variety of places. Garden centers, arborists, tree care companies sometimes have it available. Municipalities, the city of Hayes, we have a mulch pile at the city parks department where you can go in and pick up wood chips for free. So that's a great opportunity there. That's what I use at my house, and it works really well. Step number 5, right plant, right place, or plant zones. We're going to talk just a little bit about this, but this is simply just dividing your landscape up into areas that have different water requirements. So maybe you have areas close to the house that are more water intensive. And then as you move farther away from the property or the house, then things might be a little less water intensive. And if you are searching for information online about ZERO-SCAPING, you oftentimes hear the term hydrozoning, and that's simply what that means. It's putting plants into zones. Excuse me. So what does right plant in the right place mean? Well, it's essentially just picking the plants that are adapted for your environment and appropriate for your location, your site. We talked about microclimates earlier. You don't want to put a plant that's very sensitive to heat and sun in a very hot and dry location. So it's very individual. You need to make sure that you pick plants that are good for your location. Learn about the moisture requirements of the plants that you have chosen or that you already have in the landscape. Is it drought tolerant? Does it need more moisture? If you are unfamiliar with the plants, which many people are, that is certainly okay. That's no big deal. There are resources available to help with that. One great resource is the Extension Office, K-State Research and Extension. They will help you identify your plants. But there's certainly benefit to knowing what's actually in your landscape, or deciding which plants you're going to choose based on what it needs. Again, grouping plants with similar water requirements. We talked about this earlier, but having those trees grouped together and mulched not only makes it easier to water, it makes it easier to maintain. Over time, with the WaterSmart landscape, the goal is to not have to do too much supplemental irrigation at all. So you want to choose plants that after they're established will just survive on our typical rainfall. Some examples: native grass like turf grass, buffalo grass, excuse me, and other things that you might be able to plant in combination. If you need help figuring out what works best, there's recommended plant varieties or recommended turf grass varieties, all those things available from your local extension office. Step number 6, practical turf areas. Cool season turf grass such as fescue or Kentucky bluegrass typically require the most water and maintenance in our landscape. So you want to limit those types of turf grasses if you can. Consider using mulches, ground covers, ornamental or native grasses, shrub beds, decks, or patios instead. And I always show this picture because, you know, is this a practical area of turf grass? Are you going to be playing soccer on this area? Probably not. Excuse me. Are you going to be having a picnic in this area? Probably not. So these are things to consider. If the only traffic that your turf grass is receiving is from the mower, then chances are it could be converted or changed into something else. You want to avoid odd shapes or narrow strips of turf grass, as these can be very difficult to irrigate. But there are other options, and some of these pictures are not from Hays, Kansas. So, you know, can you put in some sort of tiered retaining beds, retaining walls, stone walkways, other things to do besides having vast expanses of turf grass that need extensive irrigation. This picture is from Hays. Was one of our WaterSmart Landscape Award winners last year. You know, nice mulched bed, native grasses, shrubs, other things besides turf grass. What about this one? Is this practical? No, it's not. This narrow strip of turf grass, unfortunately, these do exist. Very hard to maintain, very hard to irrigate efficiently, not practical. Here's some pictures I like to show. This is not in Kansas once again, but these are just some of those areas in between the sidewalk and the street that can sometimes get very hot and dry. Excuse me, apologize. And sometimes they're referred to as hell strips. So hot, so dry, hard to irrigate sometimes. What do you do with it? Well, this is a great example. This is a neighborhood where they went in, did some soil mending, put in some ornamental grasses, some drought-tolerant plants. And over time, as things got established, you can see this turned into a really beautiful planting along this street. And this is certainly something that can be done here in Hays for those border areas, areas in between the street, like I mentioned. And just a wider shot of that neighborhood. This picture, although it's kind of hard to see, this actually is in Hays. So it can certainly be done in Hays, Kansas, having ornamental grasses and other things planted in those areas between the sidewalk and the street. And this is just a little illustration of a side yard. Sometimes with our newer properties, the side yards are very narrow and it makes it difficult to efficiently irrigate turf grass or even sometimes to get turf grass to grow if it's extra shady. And so this is just an example of something that could be done. Excuse me. Now, while proper, you know, a WaterSmart landscape can certainly be lower maintenance at times, it is not maintenance free. And so no landscape is. Even if you have fully rocked front yard, it's not maintenance free. And so proper maintenance is definitely an important step of a WaterSmart landscape. Proper mowing, proper weeding, proper fertilizing, watering, all of those things are very important to help your plants be as healthy as possible and make them as water efficient as possible. You want to make sure to scout your plants for insects and diseases. Properly identifying those things is very important. And if you have evergreens, you may be familiar with this insect that is shown here. It's a bagworm. And so, you know, if you know what the pest is, then you might learn a little bit about its life cycle and know exactly when to treat or ideally treat for that pest. Again, there are resources to help you with those things if you do not know. One thing to mention is that a lot of insects are beneficial. And so if you see some things on your plants, don't just go out and start spraying. Sometimes things are beneficial. This little alligator looking insect, or the spiky insect, is actually a ladybug larvae. And those are beneficial, so you don't want to kill those. So if you see something like that, make sure that you know what the pest is before you go ahead and treat. And then also caterpillars turn into butterflies oftentimes, and they might be doing some damage, but again, this is a beneficial insect and not something that we should just be out spraying something for. So remember, WaterSmart landscaping is not zero-scaping. And I always show this picture and I always think, who would really want to sit in that hammock in that backyard? Just does not look inviting to me whatsoever. But WaterSmart landscaping is not zero-scaping. So it does not have to be rocking your yard and eliminating all plant materials, or even the majority of the plant materials. It is actually that 7 steps that all together will create a beautiful landscape. And there are some beautiful ones in town, very water efficient, very beautiful, creative landscapes. And so this is what it can actually look like. And, you know, I went over this fairly quickly, and this is a different format to give this presentation than I typically do. But I mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, please give me a call or email me. Right now, it's easier to email me than to give me a call with the crazy work schedules right now. But also, you can receive more information if you visit our website, watersmarthays.com. And if you have questions, again, please reach out and contact me. Thank you for listening. I hope that this was beneficial, and I thank the Hays Public Library for hosting this event.